There's a certain kind of pride that's baked into your bones when you're born and raised in Texas. It's more than just loving where you're from, it's a belief system. We're the Lone Star State for a reason. We're independent, self-sufficient, tough. We've got our own power grid for crying out loud. We don't need the rest of the country to keep our lights on. That was the story I told myself, the story we all told ourselves. It was a comfortable, sturdy belief, like the brick of my small three-bedroom house in the suburbs of Dallas. That house was my piece of the Texas dream. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I'd worked my whole life in manufacturing, steady work, honest work, and I had a life to show for it. A paid-off truck, a good credit score, a quiet street. I believed in the systems we had in place because, for the most part, they had worked for me. Then came February 2021. We all knew it was going to be cold. The weather reports were breathless, talking about an unprecedented Arctic blast. At first, it was a novelty, snow in Dallas. The kids in the neighborhood were ecstatic. I took a picture of my front yard covered in a thin white blanket and sent it to my sister in Chicago with the caption, "Look, we're just like you now." The joke would turn bitter in my mouth just a few hours later. The temperature didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. The world outside my window went from a novelty to a threat. And then the lights went out. It was just after 2 a.m. one moment, the gentle hum of the refrigerator was there, the next, a profound and sudden silence. My first thought wasn't panic, it was annoyance. A transformer probably blew, I figured. Happens all the time. They'll have it back on in a few hours. I lit a few candles, checked on the kids, and went back to bed, pulling an extra blanket over us. I woke up a few hours later, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the cold. It was a different kind of cold than I'd ever felt before. It was an indoor cold. A deep, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls of my house. The power was still out. The sun came up on a world that was frozen and silent. The roads were empty. The usual morning symphony of distant traffic and neighbors starting their cars was gone. There was just the eerie whistle of the wind. That first day was a battle for information. The cell networks were jammed. The internet was a ghost. We huddled around a battery-powered radio, listening to disjointed reports about rolling blackouts to conserve power. But our blackout wasn't rolling. It was a solid, immovable block of darkness and cold. By that night, the house was no longer a shelter. It was a cage. The temperature inside had dropped into the 40s, then the 30s. We could see our breath. We piled every blanket, every coat, every towel we owned onto one bed and huddled together, a small island of shivering humanity in a sea of cold. The feeling that settled in was something I'd never experienced before, true, primal helplessness. I was a father, a husband, a provider. My job was to keep my family safe and warm, and I was failing. The tools of modern life, the thermostat on the wall, the light switch, the stove, were all useless monuments to a civilization that had evaporated overnight. I looked at my children, their faces pale and their lips tinged with blue, and I felt a rage building in my chest. A cold, hard rage that was a stark contrast to the freezing air. We were in the energy capital of America, a state whose identity was built on oil derricks and power plants, and we were freezing to death in our own homes. The second day was worse. The pipes froze, then one of them burst in the wall with a sickening thud. Water began to seep under the baseboards, freezing into a slick, treacherous sheet on the floor. The house was actively trying to kill us now. We made the decision to get in the truck and try to find a warming shelter, but the roads were impassable, littered with abandoned cars. We were trapped. We survived. That's the short version. We survived by boiling snow on the gas grill outside for drinking water, by wearing 4 layers of clothing to bed, by telling stories to keep the kids' minds off the crushing cold. We survived, but something broke in me during those days. The pride, the easy belief in our Texan self-sufficiency, it all cracked. We weren't independent. We were victims of a system so arrogant and so unprepared that it had failed in its most basic duty, to provide the power that keeps its people from freezing in the dark. When the power finally flickered back on after 4 days, the feeling wasn't just relief. It was a complicated, toxic brew of gratitude, anger, and a deep, lingering trauma. For months afterward, every time the lights would flicker for even a second, I'd feel a jolt of pure animal panic. The sound of the furnace kicking on became the most beautiful sound in the world. We cleaned up the water damage, got a plumber to fix the pipes, and tried to put it all behind us. We heard the horror stories on the news about people on variable-rate electricity plans getting bills for $17,000. We felt sick for them, but a part of me felt a grim sense of relief. We had a fixed-rate plan. We were safe from the financial fallout, or so I thought. The freeze receded into memory, a shared nightmare that we Texans would talk about for generations. Life returned to its normal rhythm. The brutal cold was replaced by the familiar, oppressive heat of a Texas summer, and with the heat came the air conditioning, and with the air conditioning came the electricity bills. I opened the first one for June without much thought. My eyes scanned down to the total. I stopped. I read it again. It was nearly double what I had paid for the same month the previous year. I felt a hot flush of anger. I stormed over to the thermostat, convinced my wife or the kids had been secretly setting it to 68 degrees. But it was right where we always kept it, a sensible, budget-conscious 76. I calmed myself down. Maybe it was a fluke, a particularly hot month, a meter-reading error. I paid it, but the number stuck in my craw. Then the July bill came. It was even higher. I pulled out my old statements, my hands shaking slightly. I laid them out on the kitchen table. The usage, the kilowatt hours, was almost identical to the previous year, but the price per kilowatt hour had skyrocketed. And then there were new line items, unfamiliar fees with bland, corporate names. Uplift balance charge, system resiliency fee. I didn't know exactly what those words meant, but I understood their message perfectly. They were making me pay for their failure. The grid that had abandoned me, that had left my family to shiver in the dark and watch our pipes burst, was now sending me the bill for its own catastrophic incompetence. The cold rage I had felt during the freeze came rushing back, but this time it was white-hot. It was no longer about survival. It was about insult. It was about injustice. It was about being robbed in broad daylight by the very people who were supposed to be keeping the lights on. The kitchen table became my command center. I spread out the bills, a paper trail of my own financial bleeding, and the numbers stared back at me, cold and unforgiving. This wasn't a small increase. This wasn't inflation. This was a fundamental shift in the cost of living, a new, unofficial tax on existence in Texas. My carefully planned family budget, the one that had weathered years of ups and downs, was now being methodically dismantled by a single, rapacious utility bill. The feeling of betrayal was what I couldn't shake. It was a deeper wound than just the money. During the freeze, we had all felt a sense of shared struggle, a we're all in this together spirit. Neighbors checked on neighbors, strangers shared firewood. Now that feeling was gone, replaced by the isolating realization that we were all just individual customers to be squeezed. The we had been a comforting illusion. The reality was a collection of accounts to be drained. My first call was to the power company. I waited on hold for 45 minutes, listening to a cheerful, looping piece of instrumental music that felt like a form of psychological warfare. When I finally got through to a human being, I explained my situation calmly and rationally. I had the data. I had the past bills. I was prepared. The woman on the other end of the line was polite, professional, and utterly useless. She had a script, and she was not going to deviate from it. She explained that the Public Utility Commission of Texas had approved the new charges to securitize the grid and pay off the extraordinary costs incurred during Winter Storm Uri. I almost laughed. Extraordinary costs? You mean the costs your company and the generators incurred because you failed to winterize your equipment? The costs you ran up selling power for $9,000 a megawatt hour while my family was huddled in a freezing house. She had no answer for that, of course. She just repeated the corporate mantra. Sir, these are approved and regulated charges to ensure the stability of the grid for the future. The word stability was like a slap in the face. They were charging me for a promise of stability that they had already broken in the most spectacular way imaginable. It was like a home security company letting your house get robbed and then doubling your monthly fee to pay for the burglar's haul and promising it won't happen again. It was extortion, plain and simple, but it was sanctioned by the state. I hung up the phone with a feeling of profound powerlessness. There was no one to appeal to. This wasn't a billing error I could correct. This was the new system. We, the people who had shivered and suffered, were now being forced to bail out the very companies that had failed us. The anger started to simmer into a constant, low-grade stress. It changed the way I lived in my own home. The thermostat became a source of domestic tension. We were constantly monitoring it, nudging it up a degree here, a degree there, trying to find a balance between comfort and financial ruin. My wife and I would have quiet, anxious conversations at night about what we could cut back on. The kids' summer camp, the family vacation we'd been planning. These weren't luxuries. They were the small joys that made the hard work and the long hours worthwhile, and they were now on the chopping block because of corporate greed and regulatory failure. My home stopped feeling like a sanctuary. During the freeze, it was a cold trap. Now in the summer, it was a heat trap. We kept the blinds drawn all day, living in a perpetual state of twilight to keep the sun out. We used fans instead of the AC whenever we could bear it, the humid, stagnant air a constant reminder of our financial predicament. We were sweating through the Texas summer, not because we couldn't afford an air conditioner, but because we were being punished for using it. I saw the same stress etched on the faces of my neighbors and coworkers. The high electricity bills became the new Texas small talk, replacing conversations about the weather or the Cowboys. We'd trade stories of our latest outrageous bills, a morbid competition of who was being fleeced the most. There was a grim solidarity in it, but it didn't help. We were all trapped in the same broken system, complaining to each other while the automatic payments were withdrawn from our bank accounts. My Texas pride, already cracked by the freeze, began to crumble into dust. I used to feel a sense of smug satisfaction about our independent grid. Now I saw it for what it was, an island, isolated from help and run for the benefit of a few powerful energy companies. The Texas Miracle felt like a marketing slogan for a scam. The state I loved was starting to feel like an abusive relationship, one that demanded loyalty while actively harming me. The real turning point came with the August bill. It was the highest yet, a truly staggering number that made my stomach clench. It was more than my truck payment. It was a significant percentage of my mortgage. Looking at that bill, I realized this wasn't a temporary problem. This was a permanent restructuring of our lives. This was a wealth transfer from the pockets of ordinary Texans like me to the coffers of energy executives who had faced no consequences for their failures. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my dark, warm living room, the bill on the table in front of me, and the rage gave way to a cold, hard resolve. I couldn't change the system. I couldn't fight the state commission. I couldn't opt out of the grid, but I would not simply accept this. I had survived the freeze. I would not let them ruin me with the thaw. The fight for survival had been against the cold. The new fight was against the cost. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to change the way I lived, not just to save money, but to take back some small measure of the control that had been stolen from me. My relationship with my home, my state, and the very idea of power had to be fundamentally rewired. My first move was to declare war on my own home's inefficiency. If I was being charged a fortune for every kilowatt, then every single watt that was wasted was a personal insult. My weekends, once reserved for fishing or grilling in the backyard, were now dedicated to a meticulous energy audit. I became a man possessed. I climbed into the suffocating heat of my attic, laying down roll after roll of new insulation until I was dizzy and drenched in sweat. I spent an entire Saturday with a caulk gun in my hand, sealing every minuscule crack and gap around the windows and doors, hunting for air leaks like a detective hunting for clues. My family thought I was losing my mind. My wife would watch me from the doorway, a look of concern on her face as I stood on a stepladder, applying weather stripping with the focus of a surgeon. "Are you okay?" she'd ask. "I'm fine," I'd grunt back, sweat dripping from my nose. "I'm just not going to pay those crooks one more cent than I have to." But it wasn't just about the money. It was about agency. It was about doing something. The politicians were holding hearings that went nowhere. The regulators were rubber-stamping rate hikes. The power companies were stonewalling. I couldn't control any of that, but I could control the R-value of my attic insulation. It was a small, sweaty, deeply unsatisfying form of rebellion, but it was the only one I had. I replaced every light bulb in the house with the most efficient LEDs I could find. I put smart power strips on all the electronics, cutting off the vampire power they drew when they were off. I read the Energy Guide sticker on my old refrigerator and realized it was a relic from a more profligate era. We spent a weekend we couldn't really afford at a scratch-and-dent appliance store and bought a new Energy Star model, a painful upfront cost that I prayed would pay for itself in the long run. These were not the exciting investments of a man building his dream. This was the desperate spending of a man trying to stop the bleeding. The changes helped. My electricity usage started to tick downward, and with it the bills. They were still outrageously high compared to before, a constant reminder of the new reality, but I had managed to shave off 30, sometimes 40%. Each bill that was lower than the last felt like a small victory, a battle won in a war I was still losing. But the victory came at a cost to our quality of life. The house was darker with fewer lights on. The thermostat was a constant battleground. The joy of simple comfort had been replaced by a constant, nagging awareness of consumption. Every flick of a switch, every minute the AC ran, came with a mental price tag. The stress was relentless. It was a thief that stole our peace of mind. It was there when we planned our weekly grocery budget, forcing us to choose cheaper brands. It was there when the kids asked about after-school activities, forcing us to have quiet, difficult conversations about what we could no longer afford. The company that had failed to keep us warm was now making our entire life colder, smaller, and more constrained. My disillusionment with the state's leadership was absolute. I, a man who had always voted, who believed in the Texan way, now saw the whole system as a sham. The rugged individualism we celebrated felt like a cruel joke. What good was individualism when a handful of unaccountable executives and appointed bureaucrats could decide to double the cost of keeping your family safe? This wasn't the Texas I had grown up believing in. The Texas I knew was about opportunity and freedom. This new Texas felt like a trap, where the price of admission was a blank check written out to the powerful. The breaking point, the moment my quiet, desperate home improvement projects turned into something more, happened one evening in the late fall. A cold front was moving in, the first real chill since the previous winter. As the temperature dropped, the lights flickered, just for a second. But in that second, a year's worth of trauma came flooding back. I saw my wife's face go pale. I saw the fear in my kids' eyes. They remembered. We all did. And in that moment, I knew I was done. I was done with caulking guns and LEDs. I was done with hoping the grid would hold. I was done being a hostage. The fear of another freeze, another period of helpless suffering, was now compounded by the certainty that even if the lights stayed on, I would be financially crucified for it. I would be paying a premium for the terror. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my computer, not looking at my power bill, but at something else entirely. I typed home solar panels Texas into the search bar, then backup battery systems, then rainwater harvesting. I fell down a rabbit hole of off-grid living, of energy independence, of self-sufficiency that was real, not the bumper sticker version the politicians sold us. The numbers were staggering. The cost was immense. It seemed like an impossible dream, a fantasy for tech billionaires and doomsday preppers. But the idea took hold of me and wouldn't let go. It was a radical thought, a rejection of the very foundation of modern life. But the foundation had proven to be rotten. Maybe it was time to build my own. The dream wasn't about saving the planet. My motivations were far more selfish. It was about saving my family. It was about creating a small, independent republic in my own backyard, an island of stability in the chaos of the Texas grid. It was about taking back the power, literally and figuratively. It was the most Texan idea I'd ever had. The decision to pursue energy independence became the central organizing principle of my life. It was a goal so large and so expensive that it seemed absurd, but the alternative, a lifetime of being at the mercy of a broken and predatory system, was simply unthinkable. The first step was admitting that I couldn't do it alone. The kind of investment required for a full solar and battery backup system was far beyond what I could scrape together from my paycheck. This was a long-term project that would require a different level of financial planning. My wife and I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had first raged over those bills, but this time the mood was different. The helpless anger was gone, replaced by a focused, unified resolve. We were a team again, not just victims. We laid out our entire financial life. We looked at our savings, our retirement accounts, our home's equity. We started talking about things that had once been unthinkable, taking out a home equity loan, refinancing the house, cashing out a small, old 401k from a previous job. Every option came with its own risks, its own sacrifices. We were contemplating taking on significant debt, a move that went against every conservative financial instinct I had. But we weren't just buying solar panels. We were buying our freedom. We were making an investment in never being cold and helpless again. We decided to start smaller, to tackle it in phases. The first phase wasn't solar at all. It was a backup generator. After the fear of that flickering light, having a reliable source of power in case of another blackout became our top priority. We spent months researching, saving, and finally purchased a dual-fuel generator, one that could run on either gasoline or propane. The day it was delivered, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders I didn't even realize I had been carrying. We had it professionally installed with a transfer switch, so it could power the house's essential circuits. We tested it once, and the moment the engine roared to life and the lights in the kitchen came on, my wife and I just stood there holding hands, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. It was the sound of security. It was the sound of taking back control. With the safety net of the generator in place, we turned our full attention to the long-term goal, solar. We became students of the industry. We learned about tax credits, net metering, panel efficiency, and battery chemistry. We got quotes from half a dozen different companies, sitting through sales pitches that ranged from slick and corporate to down-home and honest. We eventually found a local Texas company, run by a guy who had the same anger and disillusionment in his voice that I had in mine. He had started the business in the aftermath of the freeze, and he saw his work not just as a job, but as a mission. It took us another year of disciplined, painful saving. We took on extra shifts at work. We sold things we didn't need. We cut our budget down to the bone. Our life was frugal, but it was filled with a sense of purpose. We weren't just saving money, we were saving for our independence. The day the installation crew arrived felt like a holiday. They spent 3 days on my roof, mounting the dark, sleek panels under the relentless Texas sun. On the final day, they installed the battery bank in the garage, 2 large, white boxes that hummed with quiet potential. The moment the installer flipped the final switch and showed me the app on my phone, my life changed. I could see it all in real time. The power coming from my roof, the amount being used by my house, the excess being stored in my batteries. For the first time since the freeze, I felt a sense of genuine power. The system wasn't big enough to take us completely off-grid, not all the time. But on most sunny days, the meter outside didn't just stop spinning forward, it spun backward. We were selling power back to the very company that had been bleeding us dry. There is no sweeter feeling in the world than that. Our electricity bills plummeted. They didn't disappear entirely, but they became manageable, predictable, sometimes even negligible. The thermostat was no longer an enemy. The anxiety that had haunted our home was gone, but the change was deeper than just financial. My relationship with my state, with my identity as a Texan, had been reforged. My pride was no longer in the shared, mythic power of the state's grid. It was in the quiet, tangible power being generated on my own roof. My Texas independence was no longer an abstract political idea. It was a physical reality in my garage. I had learned the hard way that the system we had been taught to trust was fragile and self-serving. My home was no longer just a shelter. It was a self-sufficient outpost, a lifeboat. The freeze didn't break me. The bills didn't ruin me. They woke me up. They forced me to redefine what it means to be self-reliant in the modern world. I still get angry when I think about the injustice of it all, but the anger doesn't consume me anymore. It fuels me. It's a reminder of why I did this, and a reminder to never, ever put my family's safety and security in someone else's hands again. What would you say if you could add your voice here? Share your thoughts, your lessons, or even your own story in the comments, and let's see how many people can find strength in one another's words.